a beef has not been squashed between the UFC and USADA. In fact, it has been created. We didn't know that one existed until last Wednesday. There were some hints with Dana White saying, you know, who cares about what they have to say and whatnot. You didn't think that would sit well. But as GC and I were enjoying our Nando's on Wednesday night, I get this email from USADA, which I think was just mind-blowing. Scathing is how I called it. Today's announcement regarding, sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. How did I screw this up? I had it ready. Here it is. This is how the press release started. Quote, we can confirm that Conor McGregor has re-entered the USADA testing pool as of Sunday, October 8th, 2023. We have been clear and firm with the UFC that there should be no exception given by the UFC for McGregor to fight until he has returned 2 negative tests and been in the pool for at least 6 months. The rules also allow USADA to keep someone in the testing pool longer before competing based on their declarations upon entry in the pool and testing results. Unfortunately, we do not currently know whether the UFC will ultimately honor the 6-month or longer requirement because as of January 1st, 2024, USADA will no longer be involved with the UFC anti-doping program. Despite a positive and productive meeting about a contract renewal in May of 2023, the UFC did an about-face and informed USADA on Monday, October 9th, that it was going in a different direction. Like just that paragraph alone, there's a lot there. Unfortunately, despite a positive and productive meeting, did an about-face. Like there's a lot there. It continues. We are disappointed for UFC athletes who are independent contractors who rely on our independent gold standard global program to protect their rights to a clean, safe, and fair octagon. Independent contractors line cuts a little deep too. The UFC's move imperils the immense progress made within the sport under USADA's leadership, which dates back to 2015. The relationship between USADA and UFC became untenable given the statements made by UFC leaders. They don't mention Dana White, but one suspects that's what they're referring to, and others questioning USADA's principled stance that McGregor not be allowed to fight without being in the testing pool for at least 6 months. One UFC commentator echoed this recently, declaring that USADA should not oversee the UFC program since we held firm to the 6-month rule, involving McGregor, and since we do not allow fighters without an approved medical basis to use performance-enhancing drugs like experimental, unapproved peptides or testosterone for healing or injuries simply to get back at the octagon. By the way, is that commentator Joe Rogan?
I'm going to assume yes.
Okay. I thought it was maybe Brendan Fitzgerald since he was tweeting a lot about this. I didn't know. And I'm not like being funny here, but he was tweeting a lot about it, so I didn't know if he was talking about it too. But you think it's Joe?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say.
It concludes with fighters' long-term health and safety, in addition to a fair and level playing field, are more important to USADA than short-term profits at the expense of clean athletes. USADA is proud of the work we've done over the past 8 years to clean up the UFC, and we will continue to provide our unparalleled service to UFC athletes through the remainder of our current contract, which ends on December 31st, 2023. As always, we will continue to uphold the rights and voices of clean athletes in all the sport. So, wow, I saw that and I was like, holy smokes, the UFC and USADA, I mean, like, that's a huge piece of news because, I mean, we've been told for the last 8 years it's the best in the business. It's all this other stuff, and USADA has this reputation. Now, it's always going to be a little bit weird because UFC was paying USADA, so it's not fully independent. They are an independent entity, but it was never fully independent because ultimately the check was being cut by the UFC. But, you know, they did step in, UFC 200, all that stuff. Those big, you know, reveals, if you will, or positive tests, they were fewer and far between. But one of the big stories was over the years, you know, the fighters complaining about them showing up at 6 a.m. or as Volk is trying to sleep in Abu Dhabi and he's jet lagged and all that stuff. And so there was some, you know, criticism. My biggest criticism of it wasn't that, you know, there shouldn't be a clean sport. I know some people like to take that stance, let them use whatever they want, all this. I don't agree with that. But I don't like the fact that the fighters don't get a say in the matter. Again, independent contractors, right? Well, an independent contractor is also someone who I call to my house if my, if my garage is broken, I can't tell that person what to wear. I can't tell that person where to be 24/7. I can't check in on them. They're independent contractors. They could do whatever they want once the job is done. However, UFC fighters have to update an app 24/7, 365 to tell USADA where they are because they need to be able to show up to wherever they are to drug test them. And if they're not where they are or where they're supposed to be, and USADA comes 3 times and they're not there, that can lead to a suspension. So if they go to Cabo on vacation and don't put that in the app, and the UFC shows up to their house in St. Louis, that's 1 strike. And 3 of those strikes leads to a suspension. What? UFC employees don't even have to do that. But UFC fighters have to do that. The independent contractors have to do that, and the employees don't. Think about that for a second. Now, ultimately, if that's what they want, great. If it's a year-round sport, great. But think about the fact that most fighters are fighting 3 times max a year, most on average, and they have to be subjected to this 24/7, 365. Okay, if you want that, great. But ultimately, this has to be something that needs to be collectively bargained, in my opinion, by the fighters. And what do I mean by that? Obviously, there's no collective bargaining agreement, meaning there's no system in place where there's a head of the Fighters Association who sits down with the UFC and goes through these things. But imagine, just like they did with the uniform, they spring this upon the fighters and they have no say in the matter. So there is drug testing in the NHL, in the NBA, in the NFL, in Major League Baseball, but that is collectively bargained. There is a collective voice. They come to an agreement and they say, okay, you can test us X amount of times or during these months or during this time period. This is all part of the discussion. The fighters have zero say in all of this. Zero. Absolutely none. And so that has always been crazy to me. And now that there's this transition, they have an opportunity to say, all right, we want a drug-free sport as well, but can we have a say? Does it have to be 24/7, 365? Does it have to be this thing where if I don't update an app 24/7, 365, like you're and you come to my house and I'm not there, you're gonna give me a strike? Does it have to be a thing where, sleep is imperative, but you come to my house at 6 a.m. and wake up my family? Like, does it have to be this way? Or could we talk about it? Could we have some kind of discussion? The next day, Jeff Nowitzki and Hunter Campbell of the UFC had this press conference, which, they're trying to defend themselves. I get it. I think they didn't like the way, Conor was used. It's a hot topic. They made it seem like Conor was like in a corner crying. I don't think he cares about this press release. I don't think he's bothered one bit. But I think that that he was so upset, that he was so offended. I don't really think that's the case. But that's the way they spun it. I did think it was interesting that they had been telling us for 8 years that they're like this beacon of integrity and all this stuff, and then they come out with all these things in this very stern voice as to the bad things that they've done and why now we should think that they're scumbags. But what they also announced was that the UFC is, according to this, I'm reading it from this Associated Press article that came out on October 12th, which is Thursday at 9:01 p.m. Eastern Time. The UFC is moving on from the United States Anti-Doping Agency, and it's creating its own drug testing program in a feud that involves former champion Conor McGregor. The mixed martial arts organization also sent a legal letter to USADA to demand a retraction and apology for a statement it issued on Wednesday, which is the one I just read to you, regarding the end of its deal with the UFC. In a statement to the Associated Press, USADA CEO Travis Tigert said, "We stand by our statement and our credibility. Drug-Free Sport International will be in charge of the collection process under the new program that begins in January when the UFC's deal with USADA ends." Former FBI special agent George Pirro, best known for interrogating former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, will be in charge of the new program. Quote, "You identify people and entities in this space that can make something that is already working well and you make them better," said Jeff Nowitzki, UFC Senior Vice President of Athlete Health and Performance. "You learn that USADA is not the only player in this space and that a combination of other entities and individuals can actually make your program stronger and better. That's exactly what's happening right now with our program." USADA announced Wednesday it is severing its 8-year relationship with the UFC over a dispute regarding McGregor. UFC officials said in a news conference Thursday the organization informed USADA on Monday it was ending the relationship. "I think it's a self-preservation tactic," Hunter Campbell, UFC Executive Vice President and Chief Business Officer, said of USADA's announcement. "I think it will ultimately fail." it was so interesting to see the UFC in this position, if only because they have done this time and again, trying to get ahead of news, trying to spin the narrative. And now someone who, let's be honest, we didn't expect this from the USADA entity. Now they did it to them, and you saw how mad it made them. Golly, they were fired up. Tiger acknowledged in the Wednesday statement that the UFC told his organization on Monday was leaving, but said the two organizations may had a positive and productive meeting about a contract renewal. And then there's more. A letter from the Las Vegas law firm, Campbell and Williams, which is Hunter Campbell's family, said Tiger's statement included several false and highly misleading representations. The letter also said it appeared to be the first time USADA has publicly announced an athlete's entry into the testing program. I know they've acknowledged it. I don't know if that's, right or wrong, personally. McGregor's fulfilled every obligation under the rules that has been asked of him and gets rewarded with that garbage statement that came out earlier this week. It's really unfair. I don't know. I think they're protecting their guy, and they were upset that they came out with it first. I don't think that USADA ever accused Conor of taking any sort of PED. I think they were just trying to protect themselves as an entity, as flawed as it may be, and let everyone know that there will be no exemptions given, like there had been in the past with the likes of Brock Lesnar. Lastly, Nowitzki says, in fact, we see from time to time that USADA has contracted out with drug-free sport and the collection network of over 5,000 strong international collectors. They test in over 100 countries. They collect over 200,000 samples annually. So for a sport with over 650 athletes in over 50 countries, they fit us perfectly. Great. And I'm happy about that. It did come out that George Piro, who appears to be, someone that everyone can trust. I don't know him personally. I would be lying if I said I had ever heard of him. Obviously, I know about the Saddam Hussein situation, and it's pretty incredible that he was the guy interrogating him. But it did come out that George Piro is someone who has trained at ATT. So, like, they put on this thing that, you can never even question his, stance, integrity, bias. It's like, training at ATT, I mean, those are your friends, right? Those are your friends. So I believe actually his Instagram is George_Piro_BJJ. And his second picture is him training at ATT. His fifth picture is him training at ATT. His seventh picture is him training at ATT. His 10th picture is him training at ATT with Magomed Umalatov. There's an inherent conflict of interest right there. I know Umalatov is a PFL fighter, but there's plenty of ATT fighters in the UFC. So this is going to be interesting. And like I said, if anyone's getting paid by the entity, doesn't matter. You can't fully be independent if you're being paid by the entity. You're just not. Now, do they deserve a lot of credit because they're the only promotion that does it? Yes, of course. And that's what they'll tell you, and they deserve that credit. Bellator doesn't have a drug testing system in place. Neither does PFL. Neither does Top Rank or Matchroom or anyone else under the sun. It doesn't exist. And so they deserve a lot of credit for that, even if there are conflicts of interest. Let's not get this twisted. The only reason why I bring this up at the end of the day is there's a moment in time right now where the fighters could say, all right, you want to do this? Well, we're in a transition period. Let us have a voice. Is it going to happen? No, it's not going to happen. I'd be shocked if it did. I would be shocked if it did. And ultimately, am I rooting for it? No. I'm just telling you what I think is going on here and what could happen if the fighters recognize the situation. But they are in a position where they don't say much for whatever reason, and they're probably going to accept this just like they accept the fact that, they have to wear uniforms, they don't get a cut of the TV deals, they don't get a cut of the sponsors on the mat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, the biggest inconvenience of them all is this drug testing situation. Why they wouldn't want to speak up to make this at least as comfortable as possible is beyond me. But they're the ones that are going to have to deal with it. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in this new era come January 1st. Will there be a 6-month period? Will they allow fighters to take PEDs and of some kind just to recuperate? Right. This is something that's been brought up. These rules that we have been kind of beholden to when talking about these situations, it's all out the window now. It's a whole new era. Now people are joking that this guy and that guy are going to come back. And I think that the UFC was always going to have something in place, but it's going to be very interesting to see if the fighters do say anything. Does George Piro still train at ATT in the midst of all of this? Feels like a bit of a conflict. What exactly is drug-free sport, and how stringent are they going to be? And what does USADA do? Do they just move on from the sport of MMA, or do they team up with someone else? Who knows? So a very fascinating story to monitor, and another crazy stretch. Thanks for watching. We appreciate it very much. Hey, if you like this video, give us the old thumbs up. Subscribe as well. You could get many more of these videos on the channel, so please do that. We would love you forever if you did so.